All right. Hello, welcome back to Dan's Astrology, which feels weird to say, recording in this other room where I sometimes make music, which is not set up with my collection of astrology books behind me to show off or anything like that. Instead, I have this collection of synthesizers to show off, which perhaps is suitable for the topic that I'm going to be talking about because I'm following up basically on a video that I recorded yesterday in which I was talking about Uranus ingressing into Gemini, and specifically I was focusing on the idea of anti-memetics, which more or lless there's a part of the idea of anti-memetics I didn't really get into, which was the not just things that are not really catered to going viral or popular, or maybe an attitude away from sharing things openly, or just being always very transparent and visible and open about things. There's also the other quality of it, which is or whatever, taboo things you don't want to talk about, or the having maybe something you don't want to talk about because it makes you uncomfortable or something like that. Or there can be sometimes I find that Uranus there's something about the chaotic kind of unpredictability about Uranus that makes it kind of like anxiety provoking. And I have to admit that there's a certain kind of like anxiety about Uranus changing signs, especially based on there's something about when you're trying to understand the effect of any given astrological transit, that it's not just happening on its own, it's happening with a bunch of other transits in a complicated, so we're isolating certain things and talking about one thing on its own. But because of there's a certain, Uranus tends to be a little bit more frenetic, chaotic, energetic, and that there can be a certain anxiety around that. There's also something to do with technology, where Uranus is actually associated with things like electronic music. So maybe there's something about that. The be more specific though, there's something about in American history with the fact that in the American Sibley chart, the fact that America has Uranus and Gemini, and that apparently historically when Uranus has been in this Gemini 7th house position for the American Sibley chart, there's been a period of war, basically, right? So most astrologers, in basic how we were set up leading into this with the war in Iran and the chaotic state of affairs in America, is basically a fairly anxiety-provoking transit. And there's something about like that kind of sensitivity of the subject, and my own. I have this sort of, it kind of makes it feel like a sort of like the Uranus into Gemini is like a hot potato issue that I don't really want to deal with. But then what I'm also realizing about it is there's another, rather than focusing on this like global political issue, there is the Uranus and Gemini as a however it affects people in a more personal thing with their own lives or whatever. And I was at least basically trying to be more optimistic about it because, for one thing, Venus is in Taurus right now, and this is kind of my idea for this video, that Venus is in Taurus with Uranus, and prior to the ingress of Uranus in Taurus, there's going to be a Venus and Uranus conjunction at the anaretic degree of Taurus. And at the very least, because Venus is in good dignity in Taurus, then that helps to make this whole thing a lot easier. And so, like, with that in mind, I thought I could, like, perhaps take the opportunity to hone in on this sort of dynamic of this Uranus ingress with the aid of the Venus, the domicile ruler of that sign, kind of guiding it along into Gemini, kind of thing, right? Is that there's some kind of like, silver lining, or like something potentially good about this if you consider the good dignity of Venus in this position. However, this is also made increasingly more difficult by the fact that the that area of Taurus is where the fixed star Algol is located. And I actually noticed something in when I'm like paying attention to my habit of recording astrology videos over the years, is that a few years back I was making more videos about fixed star Algol, and admittedly part of the problem is that it's probably got the worst reputation, or being the most like totally malefic and gnarly of all the fixed stars. And but there's something funny about it, where I was recently, the algorithm had recently presented to me some sort of someone else's astrology channel, and I ended up watching some video somebody else did on Algol, and it was like repetition of things I already was familiar with and stuff like that. And there was one of it was also interesting because it leads into this kind of topic around basically, to make a long story short, because the word Algol is etymologically related to the same source of the word alcohol, and there's this sort of like problem with alcoholism and the bad spirit or negative energy, you could say, that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with, right? And there's a problem with alcoholism and addiction and stuff like that. And the thing is, you could extend this away from alcohol to other drugs as well. And there's this kind of thing about this whole situation where, I don't know if I might as well just be transparent about where I'm at with all this, because I'm not claiming to be like somebody who is a officially trained counselor or a therapist, or like I do have some basic experience where I was doing like peer support groups, but in a way that was like outside of the mental health system, because I have a very just bad associations with doing things within the state-run, medically dominated mental health system and stuff like that. And there is a whole obvious thing about like mental health stuff happening alongside addictions, and a lot of the time the addictions thing takes the more primary focus. And in all of this, I have to admit that over the years I've been perhaps this has been an obstacle for me for being what I find that a lot of times people may use the recovery from addiction to sort of like springboard them into a career being a person who does this kind of work, because they can sort of talk about how they've dealt with their own problems and kind of provide counseling for other people. And that often this is kind of like it finds itself in a situation where there's the alternative healing things like ayahuasca or psychedelic therapy and stuff like that. And I'm live in British Columbia, where Gabor was famous as a person who really popularized this. And I got my astrology training from Elenbaas, a guy who did all this kind of stuff. But there's some kind of thing about this where it's always been like a little bit different for me, because primarily, like, I don't have the story of being somebody who is addicted to alcohol or addicted to painkillers or opioids or all these other drugs. It was just, for me, it's kind of like the other way around, because I basically, at a certain point in my life, was experimenting with psychedelics, and it had some kind of, I guess you could say, psychedelic trauma or psychotic break from psychedelics or something like that. That is different than being like there's this premise of like addiction recovery with the whole premise of like fixed star Algol, and the idea that there are negative spirits associated with alcoholism, is that the guy who started Alcoholics Anonymous apparently was the main motivation for him was actually very much connected with his own psychedelic experiences of using, like there's this whole idea that if you're locked into an addiction, and if you use something like LSD or magic mushrooms or something like that, it gives you some kind of other experience where you're more conscious of the dynamic going on, and that somehow motivates you to like change your behavior or do something differently. And so it's like I kind of had this problem where like instead of having the problem being a lot of I obviously when I was a young person going out and partying, it wasn't like I didn't drink or like party or anything like that, but it was like the main issue wasn't really so much with the drugs that have a narcotic effect, like opioids or stimulants or alcohol or all that kind of stuff. It was more of it's like the shock of psychedelics but there's chasing some kind of psychedelic high of like wanting to have the wisdom and insight to like learn about my problems and try to get better, but just like not doing that in this sort of like approved of social container, and instead of just kind of like being kind of wild and adventuring, being a young person or whatever. And it's also interesting because like apparently there's this whole kind of dynamic. I mean, I don't know. You guys probably know about this. Like the guy who did Burning Man, the guy who invented Burning Man was hospitalized for being manic and stuff. Like, so there's this whole kind of inner, like at the center of psychedelic culture, you also have like Ken Kesey, one of the original acid guy, was the guy who wrote, the guy who did the Merry Pranksters and the bus that toured around and all that, the acid tests. This was the guy who wrote Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's like at the very kernel of the psychedelic movement, there's that kind of dynamic where these drugs could like make you motivated to get over your addictions, but they could also make you go crazy or something like that. Anyways, that's kind of more where I'm coming from it. And in that process, I will keep the specific details private, but in my practice of doing astrology readings for people, a lot of it was, people that I met in kind of a peer mental health movement. And I want to, I'm not going to go into any specific details, but I have done a number of charts for people who have Algol placements. And if it's not addiction issues in their own life, there's addiction, it could be like falling into a toxic relationship with somebody who has a serious addiction issue, right? And that being like there in all of this. And I have to admit that I'm maybe not perfect with this, but I am at this point, since the pandemic, since I had some health crisis going on, I've been not drinking alcohol longer than any other point in time in my life. And I've been not using nicotine or tobacco products for longer than any time in my life. I haven't been not using any party drugs or stimulants for any longer in my life. And I have to say that being a complete Puritan about it is something that doesn't really, at some point, if I'm being like just a complete Puritan, I have to admit that I live somewhere where marijuana is legal, and I have, maybe it's just my personality, but I've always had this personality as when I was a young person who was partying, having more of an attraction to wanting to smoke marijuana than wanting to get drunk. And in this whole thing, there's some kind of issue about it where the whole attitudes around my experience with dealing with Algol is there's like, you have to appreciate that different addictions obviously have very different characteristics, a different kind of spirits, I guess you would say, that would be attached to them. And for this reason, it's never really been that difficult for me to quit alcohol, because I've found that the negative energy associated with the alcohol vibe just was never really that appealing to me in the first place. And it was like, for me, it's not such a hard thing to be non-attached to. And when I've seen it in other people's charts, they can be, you can have similar, there's this problem of like the negative entity attachment of addiction, right? Where people are trying to say that there's a spiritual thing that goes with addiction, where the addiction is like you go unconscious and then you become possessed by negative spirits that like I have actually met people who were recovering alcoholics who described it in such a way that they had to be very careful not to drink because it was like there was an entirely different subpersonality that when they were sober that they were able to keep at bay and keep under control and keep in a, you know, like have a polite way of dealing with people and not get and not cause trouble. But then if they were to relapse into alcoholism, they had some sort of id, a repressed, socially malignant subpersonality that would take over and basically ruin their lives, right? And the thing is that obviously that is what basically creates the stigma of addiction, that people who are addicts, when they're using substances, they give themselves over to some negative spirit that ends up having destructive consequences on their lives, right? And that is, there's this, getting into the actual myth of what Algol represents, it all has to do with the problem of Medusa, the Medusa and Perseus killing Medusa, and there's all this kind of like inherent patriarchal, this weird thing about like the repressed, you know, it's kind of like victim blamey basically, right? I'm not, and it's a big, like there's this, what I'm kind of realizing is there's this kind of big kind of thing with Algol in that there's some kind of the way that the history of alcoholism or history is connected to a history of patriarchal abuse against women oftentimes, where you have, you know, men who are alcoholics who, you know, switch off their consciousness and then become possessed by some destructive evil spirit, right? And which gives alcoholism such a bad name. And in contrast, I mean, what can I say? I'm just trying to say, like, marijuana, in my experience, just doesn't have this same connotation for me. But at the same time, I don't want to be too... I remember watching this video recently where Elon Musk was on some podcast talking about his psychedelic therapy and talking about how, like, you know, no one's going to be, like, violent on magic mushrooms. And I'm like, you want to bet? Because, you know, I can't say anything for sure. Because, I mean, there's a party that I went to that was like, I kind of like when I stopped, there's a certain scene that I was wanting, I was like thinking that this would be kind of like the answer for what I was going to do because I like music. I was going to be like, there's, you know, go to like the consciousness raising festivals. Cause I'm all into like, you know, this sort of like smoking weed and expanding my consciousness and dancing to music and stuff like that. And I went to one and it was interrupted because somebody was killed at it. And I don't know exactly. I'm imagining the fact that this guy was, there was probably something where some guy was freaking out and drugs were related, right? And I don't think that, like, you can't be naive and be like, oh, yeah, if there's all these bad drugs and there are all these good, then the other ones are good ones, right? These are the good drugs which make you, which is like a therapeutic thing, which you're not going to be violent on. There could, like, how are you ever sure there's going to be anything is completely risk-free, right? Like, there's, and so this is basically, but there's also this kind of like underlying dynamic with like the dangers of the addict. You know, we have this image of the addict, the mentally ill person, the dangerous criminal, and the homeless person, and the need to protect society from the malefic or the dangerous influences of these people who have given up on life and have turned themselves over to these maligned forces of addiction. But then the funny thing is that like in, you know, we've also had these people that we've normalized the state of affairs of just like a military industrial complex, for-profit wars for-profit prisons, and for some reason all the pain and suffering that's generated from war, and that's all the pain and suffering that's generated from keeping people in prison their whole life, and all the pain and suffering that's generated from, you know, shitty mental health treatment where people are basically warehoused away and or you know, not really rehabilitated, just drugged up and sedated or something like that. Like, there's all these kinds of different ways of that are socially approved that nonetheless probably generate tons of pain and suffering that could be said to be you know, feeding the negative spirits of resentment and you know, there are all kinds of, you know, probably hellish demons that set themselves up in like approved of institutional settings, or things that we deem necessary for the safety and security of our society, or even, you know, if you see the shit show that's playing out in politics, and how it's normalized, whatever, somehow it's normal, like. It's hilarious too about how I find the algorithm on the internet works, because when it comes to things like psychedelic therapy, there's or the problem with like Elon Musk being a guy who does a lot of ketamine or something like that. It's like there's this article that came out where it criticizing Elon Musk of all this drug abuse and all this kind of stuff. And then after listening to that, like people talk about that, what the algorithm does is like show me videos from guys who are like these like psychedelic therapy bros, and they're just like, instead of being like concerned about the problem that you've got these rich, like if you're like a poor person and you do these drugs, you're a criminal and you're an addict and you're a user. But if you are a rich elite person, they're like your therapy and they're a source of inspiration, and they're basically, you, rather than creating this thing about like, oh, we should be more critical of these kinds of therapies, they're like, yeah, Elon Musk is actually on the cutting edge of like embracing the new, you know, the new modes of therapy, and we're just going to be like normalizing this, where pretty soon, in a couple of years, everybody's just going to have like instant like ketamine, you know, disposal things, and everybody is going to be managing their anxiety and their depression and their ADHD by just like doing lots of ketamine. And so we're just going to, you know, spin this in a way so that you, like, if you want to make some investments in my psychedelic therapy business, you know, like, here we're going to be going public next, you know, that kind, like, it's this big like growth industry, and like they're trying to be like, oh, any, you know, it's like there's some kind of disconnect of, or like where you're like in this kind of like this sort of, at a certain, it's all whether or not, basically take the perspective that there's maybe not good drugs or bad drugs, but rather like in the certain perspective that is created by power relations, there are people that get to enjoy certain things in a certain realm of privilege, and there are people that if their version of doing the same thing puts them on the other side of the seesaw where they're oppressed, right? And a lot of the criticism that's come around, you know, there's a kind of like hypocrisy of whether or not, you know, these things are something that you can make money off of or profit off of, or a means to politically oppress certain enemies unfairly, right? Or like the whole thing of like, there's a whole justice issue with this. And I think one of the things to consider about Uranus and its disruptive influence is that there's a kind of trying to disrupt these power imbalances. And obviously there's a certain angle to this when it comes to I have to admit that it's frustrating for me as somebody who identifies as just being like a straight white guy, basically, that I am in the whole identity politics game. I am basically set up as a person who is in the category of the identity system. I'm set up as a person who is more at risk for being like, if I have an addiction problem, then that means that I'm at risk of being toxic and abusive to people around me. But then if you guys actually want to know about my actual experience in this, is that I have more of an experience being a victim of violence and crime and abuse rather than a perpetrator of it. And that it's not like, I've had things where I've had friendships that have ended, not because I have had any problem with acting out in a violent way or a negative way, but rather like I hang out with some people and I get mugged, beat up, and then for some rather than my friends, these people that were there with me in this traumatic experience being my friends, they desert me after that and never talk to me again. Not because I'm the person who's violent, but because, oh, if we're hanging out with this guy, people are going to want, like, try to beat him up or something, right? If you are a target of violence and abuse, then nobody wants to be your. Not only are you, like, for some reason, if you're the guy who's big and tough and is intimidating, then you are protecting people from the other who is a the other person's the bad guy and you're the big, tough, strong, heroic guy. But if you are a, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me. Another example of this is, I don't know, like, there are, I have to admit, for me, I'm going to this thing where I had a traumatic experience when I was younger, where I got, I was at I wasn't drinking alcohol. I was smoking weed and at a punk rock show, and, like, I got mugged on the way home from it and stabbed and stuff like that. And it's like, there's this kind of thing where there's always this kind of, like, risk of violence from people who are, like, possessed with bad spirits from doing, like, getting drunk or doing coke and all this kind of stuff. And for some reason, people are just, it feels like people are really illiterate about, like, I guess you could also be high on, I don't know. It's like, I have never been really all that violent or aggressive, but there's some kind of thing that, like, if you are a man and if you have any sort of problem, that makes you the one who is the scary bad person who's going to, like, or the problem is not even just, like, any reality of anything you may have done in terms of how you've acted to other people, but, like, if you experience any negative emotions of, like, being angry or frustrated or, expressing anything except for just mild-mannered, polite calmness, then that is, like, freaks people out because they associate it with other people who have patterns of this male violence and stuff like that. And I actually have to admit that I've had to, when it comes to my friends, I've had to end friendships basically because if people have mental health problems, I have to measure how comfortable I am in terms of my own sense of, are we safe? It's become this thing where it's now, like, you're just, like, a weak liberal to talk about safe spaces. But if you're dealing with, like, people who legitimately may have violent mental health problems or may be prone to giving themselves, like they go unconscious and get possessed by the spirit of rage or some negative emotion and act that out, there's, like, you have to, like, gauge whether or not this is a safe situation to engage in, right? And so there's this kind of, like, and there's something about the problem around all that where it's like, it creates this dynamic of, like, some repressed material you just don't want to go near. That is kind of, I think there's something that goes with Algol, which creates unconsciousness, right? It's like the whole thing about Medusa is, it's like that the face of Medusa put on the shield is, like, Medusa's gaze turns people to stone, right? And the whole idea is that, like, it becomes this thing where there's this bundle of unconscious trauma that is a anti-mimetic, in that you don't, like, it's like the Medusa anti-mimetics, right? That there's, like, this thing that's just the severed head of Medusa, and you just have to wave it, and then we're not talking about that. There's a conversation we're not having. You just, okay, one look at that thing, okay, look away. We're not going to talk about that one, right? Like that. This is basically how the Medusa's head of, and that this is used by the patriarchal hero to maintain this whole order of control and domination, because it's just, like, such a concentrated negative ball of energy that you just take one look at it and you just don't want to go there, kind of thing, right? And for this, it creates this kind of thing of, like, the quality of anti-mimetics being, like, in Gemini. Gemini has a sort of attitude of, like, I think one of the things that you might notice about, like, Uranus's ingress into Gemini, and keeping in mind this prior idea I used last time about anti-memetics, and this whole thing of like that ball of trauma or ball of like complex problem that you don't want to talk about, is that Gemini has this kind of attitude where it just gets to talk about everything, right? That, you know, you can't talk about stuff enough. Like if you instead of just having a 1 hour conversation, we'll have like a 6 hour conversation, and we'll just yak our socks off talking about it all day. But there's this kind of attitude in all this about like, it may just turn into this whole dynamic where it's like you can never actually approach the thing that is the problem. You always just have to like talk around it. And I think, I mean, the other thing that I am a big David Lynch fan, and I think, like, for me, you can draw obvious comparisons with Twin Peaks and in particular, this movie, the Twin Peaks movie, which was called Fire Walk with Me, in that it introduces this idea of Garmonbosia, which is this like this idea that you're stuck in a negative pattern, which creates pain and suffering, and that there are these bad spirits, which are like the Algol alcohol spirits, which are possess people, and that there's like, in some way, the person is responsible for their own actions, but through repeated bad behavior, they just make themselves a home for all these negative entities that cause pain and suffering, and that's basically what Twin Peaks is about, right? But there's another thing about Twin Peaks, is that there's this famous scene with David Bowie that was actually a deleted scene, and like with David Bowie is saying that we're not going to talk about Judy, and then that becomes this basis for this whole plot line in the Twin Peaks Return third season or whatever. But I have basically developed this theory that, like, you know, maybe this is just my own like fan theory or my own pet theory, but the whole thing about like not talking about Judy is basically like the fixed star Algol, or this kind of like, it's kind of interesting because it's like there's some kind of dynamic with it where you know, I don't know, maybe, yeah, I have to admit, this could just be a pet theory, but there's some kind of dynamic where, like, if we're going to try to like take all this repressed stuff and like put it out in the open and analyze it, or try to shed light on it, so it's not just something that's festering in the shadows, and try to like, this is basically it, that there's this rationalist perspective that because we live in a enlightened, rational society, that there's all these things that in a previous era of repression were just these skeletons in the closet that you couldn't deal with, but now in the new in the age of kind of liberal rationality and enlightenment, that all this stuff is something that we can use as fodder to become more conscious of by talking about and making public. But what I think what's kind of interesting is that there's this cultural moment that we're in the middle of, where there's a whole kind of like backlash against this, and it's like, to the extent where there are like, there's this cultural attitude that if you're somebody who is interested in like talking about their trauma, then you are it's like there's this industry that creates like overly sensitive little people that just want to like talk about their trauma all day, and that are, you know, just need to like toughen up, you know, that it's like a feminizing thing, right? The feminizing force has made everybody into these like insecure, precious little like people who need to be coddled and need to have safe spaces, when if you actually the real world working class environment is basically hostile to all this, because the oppressed working class have to put up with so much bullshit in the first place that it's like creates this kind of dynamic where you're just like, oh, I'm just a privileged white kid who has like, you know, doesn't really have any problems, and there's like all these other people who have much more legitimate forms of trauma, and that there's the idea that, you know what I'm trying to say is that I have this experience to illustrate this in a very blunt way. I had this experience when I was living in Vancouver Island, where I was, after coming out of the grocery store with some groceries that I bought, there was a guy who was getting arrested, or at least was being detained by the police. And it was an interesting scene to behold, because this guy who was clearly just, I don't know, probably high on drugs and probably shoplifting things or whatever. I don't know what the guy was getting in trouble for. That's basically what it looked like. The guy had, despite the fact that he was in a very compromised position, he nonetheless had a very eloquent approach to the situation, where he was saying like, you know, like, I actually just have PTSD, and I was like abused as a little kid, and I have this whole complex of trauma, and I have, you know, this keeps me locked into a cycle of addiction, and like it's not my fault. It's actually it's like this guy had like a perfect kind of like, you know, critical analysis of the situation, which he was then dispensing on the police officers. But it was just kind of comical, because I'm kind of like, can you kind of see that, like, yeah, okay, the fact that you are probably, you know, high on like meth or something, and in your head, and you have this perfect like critical analysis of the power dynamics and your own trauma and it's like, it's not going to do you any fucking good. You're still getting arrested by the police, man. And, you know, it's better just to be able to shut the fuck up and just like this is kind of like, it's like it feels like we're in a situation where with Uranus into Gemini, that, yeah, like we could have a 6-hour podcast talking about all this in a really public and open way, but like it doesn't actually change like the actual power structure. And I think you can see this in a way that's very clear with the whole crazy American situation, like when Trump had that thing with Zelensky, when he's like, you know, you don't hold the cards, we hold the cards, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a perfect analysis of your trauma, the structural, you know, things that create identity politics and all this kind of stuff. It's like, if you're getting arrested by the police, it's not going to do you any good. And now the police, you know, if the whole rule of law is breaking down, where the police will just deport you without a fair trial anyways, it's a fucking moot point at this point, right? Like the police, like if you're just going to be like, we're just going to round up everybody who looks like somebody we don't like and ship them off to another country, it becomes increasingly futile. The fact that if you are going to be like espouse your like, oh, I'm just a traumatized person who is like, you know, who's self-medicating, and Elon Musk does the same thing and he gets away with it, doesn't really fucking do you any good, even if you are correct in your analysis, and even if you're like, oh, too bad, you know, if only instead of being some poor guy who's getting arrested for shoplifting, I could have been like a sociologist, you know, I could have made my own video essays, and I had a Patreon channel, but no, here I am on the streets getting like, yeah, nice fucking try, man. It doesn't, it's every fucking idiot knows how this stuff works. You're not smart for being able to like, so I don't know, maybe this is just a kind of veiled kind of self-criticism in that, like, maybe I'm just a smart ass. Maybe everybody knows this. Maybe there's nothing, maybe I'm just, I don't actually have any new original ideas at all. I'm just telling you things that you already know. And it's at some point in time, the idea of that we're just gonna, let's just, you know, if we just take these things that are repressed and unconscious, that are, you know, lurking in the shadows of the unconscious, and we bring them to light in a conscious and deliberate, intentional way, then we'll create more awareness, and then it'll create societal change. Like, it doesn't do you any fucking good if you're dealing with the fascist regime. I'm sorry, it's like, it's completely beside the point. And actually, you know, you maybe not want, it may be in your best interest to play dumb, make yourself look like you don't know what's going on, And that might be a better survival strategy than trying to say, like, look at me, I'm a conscientious, intellectual who understands everything, and I'm going to make a little, I'm going to create a course where we can all work on our trauma together. Apparently not. Apparently people don't give a fuck about your trauma. They just want you to become get in line to join the fucking military war machine where you're just going to be exposed to more of it, right? You think these people care about like your sophisticated class analysis and your trauma informed like social justice mentality? You're still getting fucking arrested by a bunch of like a corrupt regime, basically, right? And so this is basically the problem, right? Or why there's some like underlying anxiety around it. Okay, I don't know. This is what's on my mind today, anyways. Hopefully you like this one. Please like and subscribe. Help support the channel grow. If you can do anything to help to like restore this botched astrology channel, to rescue this project from the dustbin of the algorithm, I'm greatly appreciative of your support. Thanks for watching. Okay.